Hi. Vamos a comenzar. Ya está ahí. Okay. Hi. Yes, I can hear you, but can you speak again, please? Please wait a minute. Now, can you speak again, please? No. Yeah. Ahí sonó el balance. Okay, can you speak again, please? I'm sorry.
Yeah, testing.
Perfect.
Testing.
Right now, we
That's good.
hear you. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to present you briefly, and then we can start.
Can. Yeah.
Okay. We want to thank Professor from Tan Puak, that is an associate professor in the Department of Architecture and in the School of Design and Environment of the National University of Singapore. He currently serves as the program director for the Master of Landscape Architecture program and the leader of the research cluster for landscape studies. His research, teaching, and professional activities focus on the science, policies, and practices of urban greening and ecology of the built environment. He combines his background in the science, experience in urban governance from the public sector, and interaction with practitioners to apply knowledge for urban greening to improve environmental quality and social well-being. So we are here ready. We are like 30 people here, and we are very excited to hear your conference.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, Laura, and I think it's good evening, everyone in Costa Rica. It's the first time I'm doing this kind of online presentation, so I hope that the technical stuff will be okay and the audio will be fine. So what I'm going to do now is to share my screen, so I'll disappear from the video so they can look at the slides. Yeah. How is that? Can everyone see the slides now?
I want to see. I am going to, like, you can see the audience. Maybe I'm going to share for the other side. Ay, no puede ser. ¿Perdón? No, sí, cuando él ya no nos vea, ya, aquí le doy la vuelta, ¿verdad?
Okay, I see some of them now. Yep.
Ahí, tal vez nada más queda.
Okay, good. I see them.
Yes. Okay, perfect.
And hello, everyone. Okay, so you can. I hope you can see my slides now. And I thought what I'll do over this short presentation is to introduce to you Singapore and the way we conduct the landscape architecture education here. So the presentation is divided into two parts. I'll give an overview of Singapore and why, I'll explain why I say that Singapore is an unusually green city. Then I'll give an overview of the Master of Landscape Architecture Education at the National University of Singapore. So in terms of contents on the greening of Singapore, I've provided some references here. I would not be able to talk so much within this short presentation. So if you want to find out more about what I'm going to talk about, please feel free to refer to some of the references. If you're unable to get them, I'll be happy to send you a copy as well. Right? Okay, so about Singapore. Now, I presume that many of you have not been to Singapore, but you may have heard about Singapore from this recent blockbuster, The Crazy Rich Asians. Now, this was shot extensively in Singapore, but not exclusively. So it talks about life in Singapore of a rich family. I can assure you that this is fantasy. Most of us are not that rich or crazy. Now, you may also get to know about Singapore from this event that was held in Singapore last year, June, the meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. It was a very bizarre meeting. Yep. Can you hear me? How is that?
Yes, we are still in the first slide.
Oh, you're still in the first slide?
Yes.
Okay. Let me see what happens here. How's that?
Yes. Right now we can see.
Okay. So let me do this again. So I'm going to talk about two parts: why Singapore is unusually green, and then I'll give an overview. Now, the references here are for you to refer to. Now, again, if you are unable to access them, feel free to send me a note, and I'll be happy to send you a copy. So most of the contents of what I'm going to cover about Singapore, you'll find it in the publications here. Now, again, this is about this show, Crazy Rich Asians, that was shot in Singapore. Again, I would want to assure you that most of us, overwhelming majority, are not that rich or crazy. Now, we also had this unusual meeting in Singapore, and you may have come to know about Singapore from this event. Totally bizarre event in my view, and I think the follow-up to the meeting shows that it has been totally unfruitful. But what is interesting here is also that despite Singapore spending millions of dollars to host the event, the US Department of State made a very embarrassing mistake. It says that Singapore is part of Malaysia. Now, those of you, excuse me, who are familiar with the geopolitical history of Singapore and Malaysia, we will know that this is a very sure way of annoying Singaporeans and Malaysians as well. In fact, now the two countries are going through a pretty tense period because of bilateral relationships over territory and supply of water and so on and so forth. Now, but what I want to lead up to here is that Singapore is really a tiny island located at the tip of the Malayan Peninsula, right? So it's a red dot. Our big neighbors like to call us a little red dot, and it's a term that we take gladly because we're really small. And as a comparison, you can look at some of the numbers here. So Singapore compared to, say, Costa Rica or San Jose, you'll realize that Singapore, despite being small, has a large population. It's larger than the whole population of Costa Rica. The land area is much smaller, and therefore, as you can imagine, the population density is also very high, right? So we are a really dense city. You can see it from a satellite image like this, and straight away you can tell that there are most areas that are built up. There are still large tracts of land. They are green. These are primarily the water catchment and nature reserves. You can also see patches of green. There are parks in Singapore. There are also patches of land that has been zoned for future development, but they are still forests at the moment. So Singapore is heavily built up with approximately maybe about 40% still covered by vegetation cover. The climate, I think, is it's not different from Costa Rica. It's hot, humid, tropical. So originally, the land cover was almost exclusively lowland rainforest. There were some mangroves. There was also a small percent of freshwater swamps. And over time, because of rapid development and clearing of land for a variety of reasons, clearing land for cash crops in the initial years, then followed by human settlements, followed by agriculture, and now increasing urbanization. We have lost a lot of the original primary cover. So primary rainforest now is only about 0.16% of the land. So meaning that more than 99% of the land have been disturbed, right? So what you see in Singapore has been built, rebuilt, cleared, and rebuilt over time. Mangrove, again, has been reduced dramatically. Freshwater sum is only 0.5% of what it was previously, right? So now the primary land cover in Singapore are secondary forests, young and old, about 27%. Even though Singapore is a garden city, parks only occupy about 3.2%, and built-up land is about 68%. Right? All this transformation, as you can imagine, are therefore associated with a very high level of species extinction. So that was what happened primarily over the last 200 years or so. Now, but Singapore, despite being such a dense city, has also over the years gotten a reputation of a very green city. It has been called a garden city, and now we tend to call it a city in a garden. And it also has been given the name of a city of gardens and water, a vertical garden city, a biophilic city. I think the latest term that we hear about Singapore is a biophilic city in a forest, something like this. In many ways, I think the names are not important. I think what it reflects is that there has been a very highly successful urban green program, to the extent that I often say that Singapore is obsessed with being green. So urban greening over the last 50 years plus has been a very integral part of the urban development approach of Singapore. I go to the extent of saying that Singapore is unusually green. Right, so here you see an aerial photo of, I would say, pretty typical housing area in Singapore. Because of a very high population density, I'm not sure about the case in Costa Rica, but in Singapore, the large majority of people live in high-rise apartments. More than 90% of us live in high-rise apartments, and more than 80% live in public housing. So this is a view of a town, almost exclusively public housing. You can see from the image that despite this density, there are green spaces that are interspersed between the buildings. So the large tract of green you see here is really the regional, it's a regional park within a town. Regional park is meant to be a destination park for other parts of, for people staying in other parts of Singapore. In the background, you see the nature reserve and the water catchment. Now, you can also see within this town, there's a town park over here. There's also a neighborhood park, right? And then there are spaces in between buildings. So all the green spaces that you see here are in fact required by one regulation, land use regulation or another. So there are actually numerous policies in place and guidelines in place to make sure that the greenery is maintained in Singapore even as we develop. This is another aerial photo of a scene in the western part of Singapore, in fact close to where I am at the university. Again, showing the range of green spaces that are interspersed between buildings. This is the west. This is around where I live in the east. Again, showing the same image that I want to convey to you. Now, besides the image, we have also our own data. This is our own data which we have not published, that shows the relationship between vegetation cover and population density. So one of the things that we've observed in many data sets now is that generally there is an inverse relationship between vegetation cover and population density. So Singapore appears here as pretty much an outlier. So it is way above the median. It's way above the median in terms of vegetation cover, right? Compared to cities of comparable population density, Singapore's vegetation cover is really way above the median. So this is why I say that Singapore is unusually green. There's another data set we took, and this is from the MIT Sensible City Lab data that looked at an index called the Green View Index, which they calculated from Google View. Again, there is an inverse relationship, more or less, between Green View Index and population density. This is the median, and Singapore is again way above the median in terms of its Green View Index. So Singapore is really a green city despite its density, and it's unusually green. So the main point that I want to make here is that despite rapid urbanization and rapid land clearing, there was a very purposeful and sustained focus on greening as a cornerstone of the way we develop. It started more than 50 years ago, and this was in an era where I would say it's not even fashionable to talk about greening cities, and it is maybe even not perceived to be important for nation building. And it is important to reflect on this because I would say that now it is almost unimaginable for any large global city to not look at programs to enhance the greenery within the city. And of course, this is done with specific objectives or motivations that are, for instance, social in nature, environmental in nature, or even economic in nature. Right? So this started in Singapore more than 50 years ago, before the advent of the current momentum that are observed in the world to green up cities. Now, what I like to now shift on to is to very quickly highlight to you what are the key programs that make Singapore green. So I'll start off with talking about tree planting. Now, one of the earliest program or initiative that was pushed forth when Singapore wanted to be a green city was really just doing massive tree planting in all kinds of locations, primarily along roadsides. In fact, this set of pictures shows the start of a Garden City program, or the tree planting program by our late former Prime Minister. And this set of pictures show him still involved in an annual tree planting day over 50 years on the same day. It is something that we still do today from 1963 till now. There's an annual tree planting day. It is symbolic in nature, but I nevertheless take it as a sign that there's a political commitment and support to keep Singapore green. So tree planting is important, and the extent to which it's important is reflected in our what we call a road code. So road code is something that the Land Transport Authority, which is in charge of the roads and private and the road communication network and the rail communication network in Singapore. This is a code that's adopted by the Land Transport Authority whenever a road is constructed. Now, the road code not only specify the obvious carriageway provision that needs to be provided, the footpath and so forth. There's specifications for the green buffer to be provided for trees and the planting verge to be provided for trees. So the green buffer indicates the setback that a building needs to have from the main road reserve line. And within this setback, there needs to be a strip of tree planting. The road code also stipulates that there has to be a tree planting verge next to the carriageway. And depending on the size of the road, there could also be a center median in which trees needs to be planted. So this was instrumental in my view in making sure that all roads in Singapore, I would say more than 90% of all roads in Singapore are planted with trees. Now, the land uptake for roadside planting is only about 3.7%, but to me, this is one of the main reasons why Singapore is perceived to be green. So my approach is always that, if you want a city to be green, the best way to do this is to have a systematic tree planting program along the roads. So this is a view of how a typical road looks like along, and this is in a housing estate. Now, over the years, there has also been new initiatives to enhance the kind of planting that we see along the roadside. And one of them was what we call a cluster planting strategy. So instead of having something that's typical, which is like having trees are planted at consistent distances apart along the road. The new initiatives called for planting of a range of vegetation under the canopy of tall trees. So smaller vegetation are introduced to create different layers of canopy, and this is a way to mimic the kind of natural canopy that we'll find in the tropical forests. And this is done with the specific intention of not just creating identity, but also as a way of creating corridors or connectors that allow our different green spaces to be connected. And this is to promote biodiversity movement. Yeah. Now, one of the initiatives in Singapore that has been just launched last year is an online database of trees that you can find in Singapore along the roads. So anyone, yourself included, can go to the website that I indicated here. You'll find a map like this, and as you click onto each of the icons, you'll find information of where the trees are located. And if you click on any dot, I can't demonstrate now, but if you click on any dot, you'll find information on the species of the tree, when it was planted roughly, so some information about the dimension of the tree, and also what the tree is doing to the environment. I think for the moment, they have just looked at carbon storage and sequestration, and there are plans to put more information when it's available. So any members of the public can really now click on any region they're interested in Singapore and find out the tree information. And this is an open database that's available to all, including you from on the other side of the world. Now, the other initiatives is that other than just planting trees primarily along roadsides in vacant land, there was also a program put in to create parks and open spaces. And the numbers I show on the slide here indicate the progression in the provision of parks through land use planning parameters. So in 1971, the land use planning parameter was that there should be 0.13 hectare of park per 1,000 people. This has progressively been increased to current 0.8 hectares per 1,000 people. And this was through an exercise during our concept plan review in 1989. And more recently, in 2015, there was a new planning parameter that has been introduced, which requires the planners to make sure that 90% of the population are within 10 minutes walking distance to a park by 2030. The image you can see here shows the transformation of a tract of land that was reclaimed from the sea in the 1970s. And most of it has been converted to a public park now. This is the largest and the most popular public park in Singapore. So this is an illustration of the dedication of land to parks. And currently, parks occupy about 3.2% of land in Singapore. Now, obviously, there's also a hierarchy of parks. And in the 80s onwards, there was some attempt to make sure that parks are distinctive and they are differentiated. So there's a range of parks that you can find now in Singapore. And if you want more information, I'll encourage you to go to the National Parks Board website. You'll be able to find, I would say, almost all the parks, large parks we have in Singapore, and found information about its locality, the range of facilities and amenities, and the kind of activities that we can undertake within the park. Now, I also think that it is very important that parks, on top of providing parks, that are green spaces that are placed immediately close to where we live. So these are the important green spaces that are interspersed between buildings. And the model that we take on is what we call a new town structural model. So you see a schematic representation of a new town model here, where the smaller blocks, all these symbols, the plus symbols are really building blocks. They are arranged in a fashion that constitute a neighborhood. Within the neighborhood, you see green spaces, and you also see a town center. And within a town, which you don't see in this image, there's also a town park. So by systematic planning process, this ensures that even as we build a high-density living environment, green spaces are created within the neighborhood level, and these are agglomerated into a town scale planning. Right, so this is an example of what I mean. This is another view of a housing estate, which we took from a drone, and you can see that within the living area, between precincts, right, you see green spaces are provided, and these are accessible to the public or to the residents at any point of time. In my view, I think this is a very important part of creating green spaces for the living environment, because not everyone has the fortune of living next to a park. So green spaces close to where people live is also very important. And this take up about 20% of our land. Right, so the third initiative here is moving our greenery skywards. And the term that's adopted in Singapore is called skyrise greenery. This is fairly recent initiative. It started from the year 2000 onwards. So Singapore can be considered a late starter, but I hope to also convey the information that is a very fast adopter. It has made quite remarkable progress in the installation of skyrise greenery. The official target figure says that there was 100 hectares that has been implemented by 2019, and the target is to have it to increase to 200 hectares by 2030. Now, what do I mean by skyrise greenery? This is an example. This is obviously a very large development that is only affordable in a hotel setting like this. But within the housing estates, the elevation of greenery upwards, simply because of land constraints on the ground, has also been very prevalent. This is an example of a rooftop garden that has been constructed above a multi-story car park. And this is becoming a norm in the way we develop public housing. So because of space constraint on the ground, and because of the need to keep on having a high presence of greenery, this form of rooftop gardens is now almost a standard way of designing public housing estates in Singapore at the moment. Even hospitals are green. This is quite a famous hospital that I would say is one of the pioneers, at least in Singapore, to push for hospital setting being green. And there are many reasons for this. It's not just to create a pleasant environment for patients. They're also driven by considerations of having green exposure to help in recovery of patients. They're also driven by creating green spaces that the community living around the hospital can access to. So in fact, there's a community farm on top of the roof that involve the residents in maintaining. Right, so this is a good example of a hospital in Singapore that has turned really green. Now, there are also other initiatives like putting green on green walls. This is one of the early examples in Singapore that was successful, where green has been implemented in a whole continuous facade from the bottom to the top. This is probably 100 meters tall, and this was one of the early successful examples. And you can also see sky terraces are accessible by the residents for use. They are interspersed at different levels in the building. Now, this is another example, recent example, designed by Japanese architect Toyo Ito, but the green, oh, sorry, this is not designed by Toyo Ito. The quote was by Toyo Ito, but this was designed by a local firm called Woha, and the attempt was to green up the whole facade of the building. This is a mixed development comprising a hotel and as well as commercial spaces. So there are many of these buildings coming up in Singapore now. Now, the fourth initiative, which I think is also really important, is that other than making Singapore green, there are now a lot of attempts to enhance urban biodiversity. Now, urban biodiversity is something that has, in my view, become one of the major policies of greening Singapore in recent years. So I made a point that we have lost a lot of species as we develop over the last 200 years. There's a lot of attempt now to recover what we have lost and to make sure that we do not keep on losing a lot of biodiversity that still exists in Singapore. And this overall strategy and program is actually coded, it's actually represented in a public document called the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. Right? And there are different strategies here which I will not go into, The document is available for download at the website, which I've indicated here. So you are free to look at the kind of strategies and programs that are put in place to enhance biodiversity. I think this is truly important because the recent evidence are beginning to show that the health responses that people have to green spaces can be improved by increasing the biodiversity level in the green areas that people are exposed to. So should not be just a way of greening cities. Enhancing biodiversity is equally important from the perspective of increasing the benefits that people have from exposure to green spaces. Now, one big push towards greening of Singapore is also the drive to involve the community in gardening. These are represented in two main initiatives. One of them is community gardens. So community organize themselves and with the help of local authorities, create and maintain gardens for their own purposes. There's also a new initiative called Community in Bloom, where residents are encouraged to not just create gardens, but also to use gardening as a way to enhance the environment. Right, so this is also taking Singapore by storm, and there are many residents nowadays involved in community gardens. This is an example of a community garden within a housing estate that's taken care of exclusively by the residents. Now, the last program that I think is important is something that is already done in many cities. In Singapore, we call this the ABC Waters Program. A stands for active, B for beautiful, C for clean. So we want the waterways and water bodies in Singapore to be active, beautiful, and clean. And this is totally similar to many other terms that exist, like the water sensitive urban design, SUDS, sustainable urban drainage systems, LID, which is used in the US more often, low impact development, and in China it's called the Sponge City Initiative. So Singapore has been pushing this for the last 10 years. And the whole idea here is to create spaces within the urban environment that are able to detain, retain, clean, and reuse water, instead of letting the water flow out to the drains, into the canals, and then discharge to the sea. So this is done for a variety of reasons. I will not go too much into this. I'm pretty sure you're aware of the drive towards pushing for water-sensitive urban design as well. This is a recent example of, again, this is a public housing estate. A recent example of a push towards doing a water-sensitive urban design at the precinct scale. So the whole precinct here, the water catchment systems has been designed in such a way that the water that is caught by runoff or directly from rainfall is channeled into rain gardens, bioretention swales. They are clean and slowly they percolate into play areas, and they eventually percolate just by gravity into a waterway that connects to reservoir. And the reservoirs are obviously created for drinking purposes, drinking water supply. Right, so this is a way of making sure that the runoff that's collected from urban areas are clean to a certain extent before they are channeled to the reservoir as a storage water for drinking. Right, so let me summarize what I've covered. I've given you a very quick overview of the greening program in Singapore. One of the key points I want to make is that greening is still a very important policy in the way Singapore develops further. And there are different motivating factors. We do it for a range of reasons. It started off with economic considerations. Then over time, the environmental agenda becomes important. And now there's also a big focus on the social factors through community gardening programs. The big key programs I've highlighted include tree planting, creation of parks and open spaces, skyrise greenery, enhancing urban biodiversity, community gardening, and water-sensitive urban design. I want to highlight very quickly some of the key outcomes. I believe the green program has not only made Singapore green, I think this is visible, but the green program from the surveys we have conducted and the results obtained also convinces me that it has helped to forge a national identity. It has created a very high quality environment. It is important for promoting health and well-being, and it is also important now to act as a foundation for us to push for biodiversity conservation. And despite spending the resources on this, I also believe that the investment that Singapore has made on greenery has slightly paid off for itself, meaning that the benefits that we obtained far outweigh the kind of cost that we put in for greening. Right, so I guess I can pause here before going on to the next section to talk about the Masters in Landscape Architecture education, and I'll be happy to take questions that you may have at this point in time before I move on to the next topic. Yeah, so if there are any questions, I'm happy to take your questions.
Laws, tourism. So basically, my question is, how are those areas supported or maintained? This is through taxes, tourism. How do you manage to do that?
I am afraid I can't catch that question. I can't hear it. Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
So can you hear me now? Better?
Yep, I can hear better now. Yep.
Okay, perfect. So basically, one of the questions is, how do you manage to maintain those green spaces through taxes or through tourism? What is like the main source of, economical or financial related? So, hello.
Hello.
Yeah. So, I'm not sure if you heard my question. So, how do you manage to support these green areas through taxes or through any other financial source?
Are you asking a question now? I can't hear it. Yeah.
Let me try to. So, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you clearly now. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. So, how do you manage to, maintain and support these green areas? Did you do this through taxes or through tourism, or what is the main source of for supporting?
Right. Okay, got the question. Yeah. The most of the public green spaces, of course, here I'm talking about public green spaces. If it's private green spaces, then it's maintained by the private property owners. So I'm primarily talking about the public green spaces. Public green spaces are funded by government revenue. So there are national authorities or government agencies that are dedicated to maintain the green estates. So for instance, the main organization that is responsible for maintaining the roadside trees, the parks, the nature reserve is an agency called the National Parks Board. And within the public housing estates, the town council will maintain the green spaces, as well as a whole range of public facilities that are present within the housing estates. Now, the question, I guess the question you have is, where does the fund come from to maintain? Well, these are government revenue. So government revenue can come from a range of sources. Tax is one. The government also invests the savings. This is another one. The government also do land sale, right? And the government also collect fees for a range of functions. So, for instance, when you stay in a public housing estate, every household has to contribute a sum of money towards the maintenance of the estate. So, all the revenue sources goes into the central Ministry of Finance, and then every year there's a budgeting process on the allocation of public funds to the different agencies for their operations. So in short, really the maintenance budget comes from revenue, all the revenue that the government has. Yeah.
Another question? Hello.
My
Hi.
question, hello.
Yeah.
My question is not related with trees, but more related with the environment in general. I was wondering how Singapore deals with land reclamation and extraction of sand.
Okay, this is currently a hot topic. I think there was a recent video that was posted on this. It has been ongoing for many years. Now, in the early days when reclamation was happening in Singapore, some of our hills were flattened. So the landfill primarily used resources from within the country. Now, over time, that resources is depleted. And the landfill that is being taken now is from surrounding countries. Obviously, if you what you may be wanting to highlight is maybe there are environmental consequences in where the resources are extracted, and I do agree with that. I think this is an issue that Singapore needs to tackle carefully. It doesn't mean, obviously, that Singapore is the only purchaser of sand resources. Even if Singapore doesn't purchase the sand could be still mined for local users for other countries. So the situation is, in my view, hazy. I do not have a full picture of what is happening, but I would think that we need to be a responsible citizen of the earth and pay attention to where we source material. I believe that the government has very strict regulations on the kind of processes and safeguards that need to be adhered to when sand is supplied. But I do not know enough of this to understand where are the challenges and the issues that we're facing. In short, I have to say that Singapore should be a responsible citizen in the way we use resources from elsewhere. But I think the situation is very complex, and I do not have a full picture of what is really happening in the world. Yeah. Okay, so let me move on to the next section. So now I want to talk about the Master of Landscape Architecture Education in Singapore. Now, at the National University of Singapore, we are the only tertiary institution that provides any kind of formal education in landscape architecture. And currently, we offer a master, and we are in the process of trying to start a bachelor program. Now, in Singapore, there's also, I'm not sure what is the equivalent term in Costa Rica. We have polytechnics that offer diploma in landscape architecture. So the overall picture is that there's currently a diploma program, there's a master of landscape architecture program, but there isn't a bachelor program. So there's a gap that we're trying to fill at the moment. So I'm going to talk about the MLA program here in NUS. Right. Now, really what we want to do is to produce graduates, and I'm sure this is a common aim of many programs in the world. We want to produce graduates who can join practice or academia, and we want them to be stewards in shaping the environment that we live in. And the three main goals, in my view, are making the environment livable, sustainable, and resilient. So our graduates must be well trained enough to be able to perform adequately in the profession, and at the same time have an open mind and the foundational knowledge to deal with the kind of dynamism and challenges all the time, because the world is changing all the time. So this is a basic expectation of what our graduates should do. Some features: we are 2-year full-time. We don't offer any part-time program. We are very young, and we're still redeveloping and developing ourselves and enhancing our program. We have taken in the 12th intake, so it's still a very young program compared to the very established programs, for instance, that you find in the US or in Europe. We are Asian-centric in the way and the topics that we address. In fact, now I think we are beginning to rethink this. Other than just being Asia-centric, we also being focusing on the tropical belt, because this is where I think there's a big gap in landscape architecture education in the world. So tropical Asian countries is our focus at the moment. We are also focused on rapidly urbanizing and highly urbanized regions of the world. We don't particularly deal with a lot of issues that are more pertaining to rural conditions or large land that you find, for instance, maybe in Costa Rica, of big forest tracts and so on and so forth. So we are looking at urbanizing peri-urban and urban conditions. We want to say that we are research-centric in the way we teach because NUS is a comprehensive research university. So research is a very big part of the way we conduct our education program. Curriculum focus is, as with many programs in the world, it is anchored by landscape design, but design has to be founded on theory and science. So there's a grounding in theory and scientific knowledge. And we also focus on involving people from the practice so that students are also aware of practical considerations when they graduate and not just know about theory and know ways of designing. Curriculum is, as I said, is anchored by design studios, so that progresses in scale and complexity. The way we have termed it is that it progresses from quarter to city to country and to region. So the scale increases and the complexity in terms of issues that students have to address also increases. We have a component on dissertation, so there's a big module that students undertake research and then write it up as a dissertation. We do not run thesis because we don't feel that thesis is a good way of educating our students. Primarily also because there's a lack of curriculum space to squeeze in a thesis, simply because we have a lot of things that we want to impart the knowledge to. Right? There are then other kind of modules covering environmental science, urban ecology, geodesign, details of design, and then there are other electives. And we also have history and theory covered as modules. Now, student mix, we are quite international, but as you can see from the information here, we primarily attract a lot of students from the region, Asian region, covering China, India, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. Now, interestingly, we took in one student from Colombia last year, so it's in our first year program at the moment. And during the interview, when we asked her why Singapore, Colombia and Singapore are really far away, right? And why Singapore? And it was something that we also sort of expected. She felt that Singapore, being in the tropics, is a good region to learn tropical landscape architecture. And I think she's also driven by the motivation of being familiar with the kind of plant variety, the climatic conditions that would influence her decision to practice and the way she practices when she returns home. We also take in exchange students, and so far we have students from Japan, USA, Taiwan, and so on and so forth. So I want to say that we are quite international in our student mix. Teaching team, we have a small core full-time teaching team, and then we have larger visiting tutors, pool of visiting tutors from the rest of the world. So the full-time teaching team obviously has to undertake not just teaching, but also research, whereas the part-time or the visiting tutors are primarily concentrating on teaching. The types of people who teach, I would generally categorize them as academics, looking at design theory, landscape science and management. And also I mentioned that we also have a pool of practitioners. I think the practice considerations are important to impart the knowledge so that students are equipped to be functional and professional when they join the industry later on after graduation. Now, I want to go through now fairly quickly the kind of studios, which is really the anchor teaching module in our program, just to give you an impression of the range of work that we do. So this is, for instance, a studio that's undertaken in the first semester. Students will, this is a site in Singapore where there's a deforestation taking place to build a new school, right? And students then ask a question, given that the forest is going to be deforested, and you can see the picture that it has taken place, how should a landscape architect react in terms of creating the kind of environment that may be able to mimic and restore some of the disrupted ecological flows of materials and energy, such as water, carbon, and how does it promote an environment that supports biodiversity. So this is a sort of introductory kind of studio that students undertake. We then look at larger scale urban interventions. You may not be able to see it very clearly, but here there's a green corridor that runs along in the middle of the picture. Now this corridor is unique. Unique in the sense that there's only one such corridor in Singapore. This is an uninterrupted corridor that runs from the north to the south of Singapore. It's uninterrupted because it used to be a railway line that connects Singapore to Malaysia. So this is a very precious piece of green asset for Singapore because it is uninterrupted for like more than 20 kilometers. So it is very rare. You can't find this in Singapore anywhere anymore in terms of uninterrupted continuous land. So students look at the possibilities and the design options for this piece of land and ask the question, what can you do with it? Now, we also focus on understanding the region. So out of the 4 studios that students take within 2 years, a minimum of 2 studios are done overseas. So students will explore conditions such as the informal settlements. So this is done in a studio in somewhere in Manila, close to Manila. And in a condition like this, we challenge the students to ask a question, what is the role of landscapes in a community like this? There are, it may not be apparent, but students have to investigate and come up with solutions and propositions. Now, we go into the region as well, so we work on peri-urban areas, and this is one kind of landscape that students are exposed to. This is a rapidly urbanizing agriculture landscapes. So a lot of the traditional agriculture systems have been disrupted because of the expansion of urban areas. In Bali, in this case here, it's primarily caused by the tourism industry. And students challenge themselves, asking the question, this sort of agriculture systems has been around for hundreds of years and is gradually being damaged. The water systems is gradually being affected because of land development. What can they do to maintain these kind of landscapes? Now, a lot of landscape architects work in the terrestrial area. We do not think that terrestrial area is the only area that we can work on. We are beginning to focus on the coastal area, simply because what we do in the land affects what happens in the coast. So in this studio, students went over to this place in Sulawesi, somewhere in Indonesia. And again, it is looking at changes that are introduced by the tourism industry in terms of how they affect the coast. The coast is fairly pristine at the moment, but expanding tourism means that the coast is gradually being affected in terms of waste discharge and pollutants and so on and so forth. Now, again, this is a studio that we took students to in a landfill area in Cambodia. It is daunting. It's a daunting kind of studio where students are open their eyes to the living conditions of that affect many people still in the region. There are informal settlements among the landfill, and the landfill is the source of income for many people. So again, students explore what is the role of landscapes in such conditions. Again, a peri-urban situation. This is an oil palm plantation in Indonesia. We are concerned with oil palm because you may have heard also on the news that Singapore and the region is badly affected when Indonesia clears its forests to create new oil palm plantations. So they burn. Burning is a way of clearing the forest. And when huge tracts of land are burned, the transboundary pollution, it is a big problem for the surrounding countries. So we undertook this studio to explain and explore what are alternatives to oil palm plantations that not only because of the transboundary haze pollution that it creates, but also, is there an alternative and what are the ways to mitigate oil palm plantation in terms of what they do to biodiversity and the livelihood of people. This is a smart city studio that we undertook to India. So India is heavily promoting smart city, and this is a 100 cities smart city program in India. So we went to Udaipur, one of the smart cities that has obtained funding from the government to push ahead. Again, we ask this question, what is the role of landscapes in a smart city? Smart city should not just be about technology. There's a role of landscapes in complementing and working with the smart city initiatives. So this was on that topic. Now this is a very recent trip to Bangalore. Bangalore has a severe water issue. It is claimed that it could be the first city in the world that will run out of water to feed its people by 2030. So despite having a water issue, there's also a need to push for agriculture. So students go to the Bangalore to understand the role of water systems, how it intersects with the green and ecology of the city, and what can they propose to address some of these challenges. Right. Now, we also have international workshops that are short-term in nature. This is one program that we did with Chiba University in Tokyo and Tsinghua University. This is done in 2017, 2018, and just recently, just a couple of weeks ago, we hosted another of the studio in Singapore, and we had our largest group of students by far. So this looked at major redevelopment plans that will be happening at the southern part of Singapore. Yeah. Right, so now I move on to talk about, so what do our graduates do? We have been tracking our graduates over the past 10 years. On average, about 70% will go into practice. This is good, this is what we want them to do. So they end up as designers, not necessarily just in landscape architecture, but in different disciplines, related disciplines, even looking at interior design, and also going to the realm of planning. About 20% of our graduates end up in public service, so they take on the regulatory role. And there are different government agencies in Singapore that are focusing on greening. So MParks is one. Then there's also authorities looking at public housing, the land use planner, as well as the industrial and business estate master planner called the JTC Corporation. So our students end up in these kind of organizations. And last but not least, we also have students who got very interested in research. Some of them have gone on to do their PhD after doing MLA. Irvin here is one example. In fact, Irvin should be joining us as our tutor soon. There are also other students who end up doing research work as a research assistant or research associate before doing higher degrees. So generally, this is how our graduates are distributed after graduation. Right, so this is the end of my slide, and our goal is really to train landscape architects. They are not just going to be professional designers. We want them to be stewards to shape the environment we live in. So this is an expectation we place on our graduates. Right, and if you need more information, you can log on to our website. I have only covered the key things, and there are lots more information, and you can also see some examples of studio products on our website. Yep, and that's it. Yeah, thank you. I think there's maybe a little bit of time for questions as well. Thank you.
If you don't have thesis, what is the way that the students graduate?
Sorry, can you repeat that? Yeah.
Yes, you tell us that the students don't do thesis.
Yeah, they don't do thesis. Yeah, they don't.
So in the program, what is the final exam, or what is the how it works without thesis?
Yep. So what we do is that they finish a 2-year structured program. So in the final semester, they would continue to do a studio. So every semester is a studio. So the final semester is still a studio with a lecture module as well as a dissertation. So the graduation is totally based on their academic records from semester 1 all the way to semester 4. I hope I answered the question. So we don't do a thesis as assessment. We use all the modules that they are undertaking. They're undertaking to assess. So everything is computed based on their overall modules.
Another question: how do you choose the different countries to do international workshops? And
Sorry, I will need you to repeat that again. Yeah.
yes.
How do you choose the different countries to do the international workshops?
I can't hear you. Maybe the mic is not facing you now. Yeah. Sorry, I can't hear you. You probably have to turn the laptop to the mic. Yeah.
Yes. Do you hear me right now?
Yeah, now it's much better. Yeah.
Okay. How do you choose the different countries to do the workshops, the international workshops, and if you have considered Latin America?
Okay. Now we choose countries based on a combination of factors. I think the most important factor is that we have some local information. Local information also means that we would have a local host to give us more information on the site and to be able to work with us together to undertake investigation. So a local host could be a government agency, it could be a local university, or it could be an NGO. And this is critical because we cannot go to a site and expect to get much information without enough support from the local partners. So local host is the most critical factor for us in determining where we undertake the research. This is one. The second consideration is, of course, the financial considerations. We go to the region simply because it's cheaper for all our students and the faculty to travel to the region. Now, we do not know, I think it will be, I don't know how much it costs, but I'll, for instance, imagine that it is very expensive to travel to Central America, even though I also understand, would think that there are many, many interesting things to do there. So the cost of traveling to Central America and the time taken to do it may be too prohibitive because the students fund themselves for such exploration. We do provide, depending on the studio, sometimes we have sponsorship from companies who are interested in working with us. Sometimes we're able to get subsidy from the department, but by and large, the students have to bear the majority of the cost for studios. So these are the two main reasons. Now, of course, underpinning all these things are that whatever they were trying to do here is fruitful to our educational effort. Right? So the issue is interesting, it is critical, and there are lots of opportunities to investigate. Right? So this is underpinning, but the two main important criteria is local partner and the cost of traveling. Yeah.
So we don't have more questions. We want to thank you very much, and I hope we can see you again here in the University of Costa Rica or maybe in Singapore.
Okay,
Yes.
thanks a lot. No, I have been trying to figure out how to turn on my video, and this is the first time I'm using Zoom, so I can't turn on my video now to let you see me. So I apologize for that. I'm not sure what you're seeing now, actually. So thank you for having me, and have a good evening. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye. Yep.